Scanifly is excited to have David Williams of Northwest Drone Pros walk us through his experience as a pilot in the Pacific Northwest. David will discuss how to fly drones around massive trees, what to consider for seasonality, types of trees, and flight automation. A bit on David. He is an FAA Part 107 certified drone pilot, the owner, operator of Northwest Drone Pros. He also currently works as a technical advisor at the PACCAR Technical Center. His previous experience includes positions as an automation technician setting up communication equipment in the oil fields of Colorado, and as an equipment engineer at Tesla Motors in Silicon Valley, automating processes in the Model S and Model X lines. David holds degrees in instrumentation and operations management and is a licensed electrician. He's also has always been fascinated with flight, and when presented with the chance to combine a hobby and a business, he went for it. And so now David also flies drones for a bunch of Scanifly customers around the Pacific Northwest. I'm going to turn it over to David and let him walk through the presentation on his side.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. All right, let's get to it. So Washington is a unique area because we have such an abundance of trees. It's not rare at all for both evergreens and deciduous trees to reach well over 100 feet. Deciduous meaning trees that shed their leaves annually, and the evergreens, of course, retaining their leaves and colors throughout the year. Now, if your $2,000 drone gets stuck in a 100-foot tall tree, not only will it be near impossible to get it out of the tree if it gets stuck, if it falls, it's either not going to be in the greatest shape or it's going to be completely destroyed. And then, of course, you won't be able to recover your images for the survey. So today I'm going to give you a few quick tips to help you get great imagery and also keep your drone from harm. Okay, first I'll start with some of the best practices I've identified through experience flying around and, of course, crashing into trees, which I've done many times. So here are some of my before flight tips. And before I start, I also want to let you know that my colleague Keith Perry, he's going to be going into this in even greater detail in the next module in just a few minutes. Okay, number one, swap out memory cards. So if you're surveying multiple locations in a day and you crash into a tree or you lose the drone with the previous survey's images on board, you'll have to return to the survey location again and get the images. And it could be foggy when you return or raining. So I just as soon have multiple memory cards. They're cheap and you swap them out, and that way you don't have to worry about returning if you do go ahead and wreck your drone. Number two, have spare props. So they're about $30 depending on which model you're flying. But if you hit something and you damage the props at a location and you don't have spares, you'll be out of luck on getting the survey done that day. And they don't sell props at the corner store, so you'll have to go to Amazon, wait a couple days, and then have to drive back to that location, which can be far at times. And the county I live in, there's islands and just there's long trips sometimes. And this has happened to me where you damage a prop and then you're pretty much screwed for the next couple days. So prop guards, I definitely recommend prop guards. They're about $30 as well, and they protect people and objects from the spinning propellers. And they also improve your flight safety because they can prevent minor collisions, such as a small tree branch bringing your drone down, which also has happened to me many times. So if you just invest a little bit in the prop guards, you can protect yourself. Now this one's a little more costly, but it's certainly worth the investment, a backup drone. I always bring a second drone because you never know if there'll be an equipment failure, or it'll ask for a software update while you're on the site, and if you don't have web accessibility, you won't be able to do that, and the drone won't take off. So personally, I use the Phantom 4 as my backup, and I use the Mavic 2 as my main drone. Okay, GPS mode. Now, do not take off until you're in GPS mode, and I think Keith will agree with me on this. I fly exclusively in GPS mode, and with DJI drones, you'll know you're in GPS mode because the upper left portion of the display will turn green, and it will say GPS on the display once the drone is locked in. And I think that requires around 9 to 12 satellites, and the satellites are how the drone positions itself. The drone will then automatically lock in its return to home setting, which means if the battery life gets low or there's communication issues, it will return to where it took off from. I never ever fly in ADI mode, which is the default mode. If there's not enough satellites or you're in a very remote area, sometimes it'll take a while to lock into GPS mode, but I will not take off if it's not in GPS mode. ADI mode is short for altitude mode, which it means the drone will maintain a specific altitude but not position. That means the drone will remain at the same height, but it'll drift around in the wind. And I certainly do not recommend this when you're flying around 100-foot swaying trees. And when it's in ATTI mode, you'll see the drone. It acts pretty erratically, and it's not a comfortable feeling in my experience. Okay, RTH settings. So you want to make sure your RTH or return home setting is set higher than the surrounding trees. The way that return home works is when the battery life gets low or the drone loses communication, it will attempt to go back to where it launched from. It will first elevate to a height set by you, then move horizontally towards home. So if obstacle sensing is off, the drone could raise up to its RTH height of say 80 feet, then start going home. But if the surrounding trees are 100 feet, then it's going to crash. Now, if obstacle sensing is on, there's the potential it may sense the tree and stop, but the battery life could be so low that it can't make it home and will fall out of the sky. Okay, now that we've covered some of the before flight tips, let's move to some recommendations for before and during flight. First, where to stand. So when I arrive on a property, the first things I'm looking at is my flight paths and my foot paths. I want to maintain a visual line of sight of my drone at all times, so I need to know where to be to see it as I navigate it. So if there's a gate that needs to be opened or I can't access one side of the property, these are all things that I want to know before I take off. In my experience, it's not the most comfortable feeling watching your drone go behind a 100-foot plus tree in POI mode, which we'll discuss later and Jason mentioned earlier, especially when there are most likely other trees behind it. So each property is of course different and unique, but you want to put yourself in the best position to view your drone at all times, even if it requires you to land to reposition yourself. Generally, you'll be flying 2 flight paths, which John's going to be discussing later, a detail and a context. The context flight is the higher flight, and it's the higher altitude flight, and it's usually around 70 feet, unless, like in my circumstance, there are trees higher than that, which most likely there are here in the Pacific Northwest. And the detail flight is usually about 10 feet above the roof line. So you just want to map out your 2 flight plans in your head and know for the context flight that with the camera angle needed, the full point of interest in frame and 100+ foot trees, you're going to need a decent diameter flight path. I usually fly the context flight first because it's at a higher altitude with a greater chance of collision because of that altitude. And there's also temporary loss of line of sight, wind, and tall swaying trees. Now there are a few things to consider when the drone is airborne. You have your camera angle, is the point of interest in frame, am I taking pictures of the right overlap? And sometimes battery life can also come into play. So I'm able to relax a bit after the context flight is finished because it's the most dangerous one. Now for the context flight or the higher altitude flight, the best position is wherever you can keep your drone in your line of sight. We're most likely not going to be able to follow its flight path on foot because of the large diameter of the flight path and obstacles such as other properties or foliage that it'll pass through. For the context flight, the first thing you want to do is fly the drone over the tallest tree to determine what flight altitude to set. So to me, that's the most important thing. I immediately show up, fly to the tallest tree. Then once you've cleared the tallest obstacle in the area, you set your flight altitude above that, and then you'll have peace of mind knowing that you're not going to hit anything when the drone is in point of interest mode. This is also helpful to determine what type of winds exist at the altitude before you start the actual survey, because when you get up above those tall trees, obviously the wind is a lot higher. Okay, now for the detail flight or the lower altitude flight. If you can, stand directly beneath the drone or as close as possible. I find depth perception to be much more acute. You only need to worry about obstacles, in this case branches and leaves, on one plane, whereas standing to the side and maneuvering the drone horizontally is harder to delineate both the vertical and horizontal planes. From the 2 images I provided, you can tell how hard the depth perception becomes when looking horizontally at multiple trees. The same with the picture on the right. It's nearly impossible to tell which branches are closer or farther. And by standing beneath the drone and using the sky to silhouette the trees, it's much easier to delineate the true edge of the tree's profile. In the detail flight, you wouldn't be flying this close to a tree that would affect the solar array of the property you're surveying, because in that case, you would need the whole tree in frame, but often you'll need to fly that close to other trees around the perimeter of the survey. So trees that won't be in the survey, but they're around the edge, around the perimeter. All right, as I mentioned earlier, the 2 types of trees are deciduous and evergreen, and each have their own unique challenges. Deciduous trees are more likely to be affected by wind in my experience. And with smaller branches and leaves, it can be harder to see the danger even when the drone is 10 feet above the roof line. And most certainly so if it's 70 feet above ground level. So these are the things you want to be aware of. We've all seen trees swaying in the wind, and in my experience, deciduous are more likely to have a greater amplitude of sway. And the higher you go up, the more this becomes true. Deciduous trees, I know, pose additional challenges to modeling because they don't retain their leaves throughout the season. So the shade analysis will change throughout the year. When it comes to flying around them in months when they have no leaves, you need to make sure to get the whole tree in frame so the model is as accurate as possible. Because of their sparseness and lack of density in the winter, they can sometimes be overlooked as an impact to the model. Now, evergreen trees, which obviously in the Pacific Northwest, we have an abundance of these. Evergreen trees have a much higher wind resistance and are less likely to sway at the amplitude seen with deciduous. So I feel much more comfortable getting the drone close to an evergreen tree, and then even occasionally splitting branches when necessary. But because of their height, the fact that once you breach them, wind speeds are always higher, and keeping your line of sight on your drone is much harder because of the density of their profile. So they're also a bit challenging. But obstacle avoidance is much more likely to see an object with the robustness of an evergreen because of the density. When it comes to flying around trees in different seasons, again, being located here in the Pacific Northwest, anytime it's not raining is a good time to fly. But my recommendation is to always check the weather before driving out to a survey. Having to cancel after arriving and then return later, it's a big waste of time. And this has happened to me many times, especially early on in my career for flying for Scanifly. When it comes to time of day, now my specific area is also prone to fog, which is often at altitudes lower than the trees. So the fog can be hard to predict, but when you have trees that are higher than the fog, then you're not going to be able to fly that day. So I like to survey in the afternoon when the fog is burned off. Too bright a sun can also pose issues, especially with a white roof, but fortunately for us in the Pacific Northwest, that's rarely an issue. But when it comes to time of day, flying surveys is of course very dependent on the area that you're flying in. There we go. So point of interest. So Jason and I both mentioned this in previous slides. It's a tool that will make your survey life much easier. The way it works is you set your point of interest and the drone maintains the speed, altitude, and circumference set by you. If you have obstacle avoidance or advanced pilot assistant software, you want to make sure it's enabled. So POI it's very intuitive and it can be set up in seconds. And I'll take you through the steps here. So one, and these are the steps for the DJI Mavic 2, the Mavic series, or the DJI series, they're all a little bit different, but they're basically about 4 steps to get you in there. So this is the Mavic 2 again. So first you're going to press the flight mode button on the left, which you can see highlighted there in red. Then step 2, you're going to select the point of interest as your flight mode. And then the POI flight mode display will pop up. And then once you're at an altitude higher than the tallest obstruction or tree and the full survey subject is in frame, using your finger, you're going to drag the square around your point of interest and press go. At this point, a warning will pop up notifying you to not operate the area or the aircraft during subject position calculation. And this usually takes a few seconds while it's getting its bearings. After that, you can adjust your radius, height, or speed if necessary and begin taking images. Now, for any reason you need to exit this mode, just hit the red X and the drone will hover in place, which sometime when I get uncomfortably close to a tree, you abort, and pressing the red X will just get you right out of there and the drone will just hover in place. Okay, you have a lot of things going on. So when the drone's in the air, you're watching your $2,000 drone, you're making sure the camera angle is right, you're checking that the whole point of interest is in frame, you're taking a picture every 2 to 3 seconds, you have trees swaying that are over 100 feet tall, the neighbors want to see what's going on, dogs are probably barking, which happens to me all the time, they don't like drones. So it's best to be aware of the dangers that trees pose and have everything set right before liftoff. Now, I hope I was able to give you some useful tips to keep in mind when flying around trees. My presentation was mostly about protecting the drone, but the alternative is going up on the roof, of course, and risking injury. And obviously, the more times you go up on the roof, the more likely injury is. So it's better the drone than you. And yeah, hopefully my tips will help you protect your drone.
Awesome. David, thank you so much. We're now going to move to our second poll question. How do you fly your drone? And so we're really here looking to understand, are you doing it mostly automated, or are you looking to do it manually or not? So the options are always automated, sometimes automated. You prefer to fly manually, or you just fly up in the air, take a marketing photo or quick video and land it. So we're trying to get a sense for how the group flies their drone and their comfort level with different modes. Give it a couple seconds for everyone to fill out this poll question, and then we'll turn it over to Keith. Okay, take a look. So how do you fly your drone? We've got about 20% always doing it automated, about half the group doing sometimes automated, and about a quarter doing only manual flights. So this is an interesting diversity here. And it's great to see that there's an increasing growing number of people who are sometimes or manual, which means that a lot of people are flying to some extent not fully automated, which from our perspective, and I probably can speak for my colleagues on the phone, it's better to know how your drone works than just to hit the button and let it go. And that's what we believe, and that's what we try to practice and to teach. So interesting results, but not entirely surprising. Thanks everyone for sharing your responses.